Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Albéric and I'm Director for Energy and Sustainability at CERRE, the Center on Regulation in Europe. And today we're happy to present and discuss our latest report, Data Centers and the Grid, Greening ICT in Europe. So the report was written by Catherine Banet, CERRE Research Fellow and Professor at the University of Oslo, and Michael Pollitt, CERRE Academic Director and Professor at the University of Cambridge. If you have not seen it yet, you will find a link to the report in the chat. You'll also see links to sign up to our newsletter and social media channel. So on the issue of data centers, they have received quite a bit of attention over recent years. So we hope that this report and today's presentation and discussion can bring clarity around some important questions. The report looks into the place of the data centers in Europe's energy system and provides policy and regulatory recommendations to ensure adequate grid management and optimization in the context of one, the road to net zero emissions, and two, growing computer needs. It was produced with the participation of several CERRE members, including national regulatory authorities, as well as energy and tech industry players. So today, to present and discuss the report's findings and recommendations, we have with us the report's authors, Catherine and Michael, Noël Matteo Goyer, Deputy Head of Unit for Cloud and Software at DG Connect, Maya Bakash, who's an Executive Board Member at France's Autorité de Régulation des Communications Électroniques, des Postes et de la Distribution de la Presse, known as ARCEP, Mo Clunan, who's a Senior Energy Policy Advisor and Team Lead for Future Energy Markets at Ireland's EirGrid, and Gareth Blaney, who's the Commissioner and Chairperson of Ireland's Commission for Communications Regulation. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all very much for being with us today. We'll start the discussion with a presentation by the authors, as I just said, and then move to a discussion and a Q&A session around some specific aspects of the report. So to note to the audience, please drop your questions in the Q&A box throughout the discussion. If you have comments that are not questions, you can drop them in the chat. When asking questions, please indicate, if possible, to whom the question is directed, and I will direct them to our speakers. So starting with the presentation, Catherine, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Albéric. Hello, everyone, and thank you to the team at CERRE and Michael and our two colleagues on this report for the nice collaboration, as well as thank you for the sponsors for the fruitful discussions. As said, we will guide you, both Michael and I, through the main conclusions of the report, and we will start by stressing the objectives we had at the beginning, and then looking at both the patterns of data centers in terms of consumption footprint, looking further at the role of data centers in the energy system and its qualification in EU law, then moving to investment and what we can foresee in terms of future commitments and investment for data centers, and then looking at our proposals in terms of regulatory approach. So first, what was the objective and what is the focus of the report? The main aim of the study is to provide regulatory and policy recommendations to frame the evolution of the data centers as key and active players in the energy system of the European Union, and to ensure as well adequate grid management and optimization in the context of growing consumption and needs. So in doing so, we attach particular importance in the report to identify and qualify the different roles data centers are playing and may play in the future in the energy system. That includes a discussion on their legal status. And further, we also frame our discussion within the 2021 European Climate Law adopted in July, and all associated directives and regulations that are in place or will be amended as a follow-up of the Fit for 55 package and more broadly the strategy of the European Commission and the European Green Deal. So climate neutrality and net zero targets are important not only for the EU but as well for the UK, which is sharing with the EU that vision. Next, please.
Thank you, Catherine, and let me add my thanks to both Catherine and Andre and Daniel, who co-wrote this report with us, and to the sponsors who made the report possible. In the report, we begin by discussing what the energy and carbon footprint of data centers in Europe actually is. That's not as easy to get hold of that information as you might expect, but we think it's something around 3.2% of EU electricity is consumed in cloud data centers in 2020. We discuss in the report what the drivers of increasing data demand and hence expected increase in data center energy demand are. There have been remarkable improvements in the efficiency of data centers. Moving data to the cloud and to hyperscale large data centers does improve energy efficiency, but there are concerns that as data continues to grow through the 2020s, the scope for matching efficiency improvements may be diminishing, and we discussed that in the report. We have an extensive discussion in the report about the measurement of data center energy efficiency. The most common measure used is power utilization effectiveness, but there are other potential metrics, and we discuss those. It would seem obvious to use measures of work efficiency related to how much work the data center is doing in processing data divided by energy consumption, and we discuss alternative measures of energy efficiency which might be better. We also discussed the fact that many data centers have backup power supplies, the so-called UPS. They also might have associated backup generators with the batteries that can power the data center for a few minutes if it disconnects from the grid to maintain data integrity. And we explore in the report the extent to which data centers can be made more flexible in meeting energy demands in the future. And we also discuss the ongoing transformations in the way data is processed, moving away from enterprise data centers to these very large data centers. And then as an example on the next slide, you can see the sort of things that we discuss in this part of the report. We do try and understand what's driving energy consumption, and of course it starts with data volumes leading to increased activity in data centers and then resulting in energy consumption. The detailed links between these different elements are something that is quite poorly understood in quantitative terms, and we try to discuss this in the report. Thank you. Back to Catherine.
Thank you, Michael. Then in the next part of the report, we are performing a new exercise, which is qualifying the role of data centers in the energy system from the angle of the EU legislation. There was two goals. First, so legally define them and then describe their role. In particular, the different relationships that they can enter within the energy system with the other actors, but as well the different roles they can take in that system. That's important in terms of anticipation of the respective obligations, but as well in terms of interaction, investments, and possible synergies with those other actors. First, in terms of definition, data centers refer as you know, to companies that have storage and or processing of data as their main business activity. And it is common to distinguish three groups within that, three groups of systems. We have the ICT equipment, we have the electrical and mechanical equipment, and we have the building infrastructure. The Joint Research Center has elaborated a definition for data center as a product group. That was done in 2020. And some other definitions have also been elaborated, notably based on the EU Code of Conduct, ISO standards, or NACE nomenclature. But still, the question of harmonization of the definitions remain, and it is important because it enables to ensure a level playing field for the efficient development of data centers throughout the EU, but as well to have a common understanding of the responsibilities of the different entities, the definition of the scope and the type of activities performed by data centers. Per today, there is no common definition of data centers in the legislation as such, which otherwise refers quite extensively to the role of data centers, and even more in the latest proposals. We find references in the Ecodesign directive based on the definition of the Joint Research Center, but it's mostly referring to some products within data centers, for example, air conditioning units. And that is already a good start, and it could serve as a useful legal basis for developing more comprehensive definition of data centers into EU law, but some work has to be done there. Looking ahead at possible legislative amendments, there have been put forward some proposals by the European Commission for the revision of the Energy Efficiency Directive as part of the Fit for 55 package, which address the definition of data centers. So that could also address the shortcoming of a lack of legally binding definition. And likewise, the proposal for a new directive repealing the current NIS directive, the Network and Information Systems Directive, includes a draft definition of data center service. So we're recommendation there is that we see those proposals are as clear improvements that must be consolidated and coordinated across different legislative acts. Second, in terms of qualification of data centers among energy installations, it is worth assessing whether, and it was part of the exercise, they could be defined as critical infrastructures under EU law, and whether this is a good idea at the end, so assess the pros and cons of such qualification. A primary conclusion from our report is that a possible qualification of data centers as critical infrastructure is not necessarily the preferred regulatory approach. These would have important practical consequences for both the data center owners and operators, but as well for the grid operators. And that may not fit with the aim purposed behind that. So of course they would benefit from certain protection requirements, but on the other hand, it raises some practical and legal challenges related to what kind of objective criteria a series of could be connected to that qualification, and as well the potential supply protection that data centers could benefit from during system stress. So therefore, we advise for carefulness and to weigh the pros and cons of such assessment. Meanwhile, we see as well a need to connect this discussion to the upcoming revision of some directives, including the NIS directive that I just mentioned. And finally, the data centers play multiple roles in the energy system, and they interact with other actors. In the report, we stress those different roles. Would they be, for example, large energy users? That's obvious, but as well grid users, electricity and or heat producers, local grid operators, or suppliers of flexibility. Thank you, Michael. Next to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So then we have a very significant discussion about data centers within the net zero energy system. And although we started off by saying, well, data centers might only be around 3% of electricity demand across the whole of Europe, it's true that they are often predominantly located in Northern Europe, and there seem to be particular issues around particular cities, which we go on to discuss. It's true that we've seen this emergence of larger scale data centers drawing up to 100 megawatts of electrical capacity. And there's further scope for this concentration of data processing within these larger data centers. So there's, demand to open more of these large scale data centers within existing clusters. So we have a detailed discussion about two cases, the Irish case and the Danish case. I'm very glad that we've got a couple of people from Ireland who are well qualified to discuss the particularities of that case, but it's clear that there is an issue in some places in Europe where data centers are concentrated, and this raises electrical problems. And in the report, we then go on to discuss what the general implications of net zero policy are, with a particular focus on large demands. And in line with much of our other work within CERRE on energy, you might expect that carbon adjusted energy prices might be rising over time in real terms as we move towards net zero, that we will increasingly have to reflect local congestion within electricity pricing and try and direct both demand and new generation to favorable locations within the grid. And I think one of the most interesting things for me that came out of this report was the whole issue of, well, if we're on a net zero trajectory and a new load, which is very large, comes along and wants to connect to the electrical grid, that may pose significant problems for the existing trajectory of decarbonisation. And, high system marginal costs if this electrical demand has to be met with renewable energy, much of which might be intermittent. But on the other side, large data centers can, as Catherine's been mentioning, provide flexibility, and they may be able to do that at relatively low cost. They can have batteries and low carbon generation associated with them, either on site or through power purchase agreements. And then on the next slide, we show some of the things that we discuss in the report. One of the issues with location is that energy isn't the only consideration when you're thinking about a new large data center. So we think about somewhere like Dublin, which is attractive for reasons to do with being proximity to existing data processing and the sort of skill base that's available in Ireland. But actually, some of the electrical characteristics of the Irish grid aren't necessarily that conducive to adding more data centers. And as we discussed in the report, it might be ideal to have new data centers from an energy point of view in Iceland, but actually from other considerations, that isn't where we're going to be adding all our new data centers. And so on this discussion, we discussed that there are multiple issues in considering where to get to a new data center. Yes, you do want to be at the best location, which is number one on this, and be in the sort of center of this grid. but often where data centers are located, they're doing well on some criteria and not well on others, particularly some of the energy criteria, and that's where some of the difficulties lie. And then just as a final interesting observation from Ireland, you know, how serious a problem is this in a particular location? Well, the red bar there shows the potential growth of electrical demand from data centers in Ireland. And what that's showing is that the entirety of growth on the Irish system is projected to come from the addition of new data centers. And this is creating stress on the Irish grid and you know, making it difficult for Ireland to achieve its net zero targets out to 2030. And this is something that we discuss in the report. Thank you. Back to Catherine.
Thank you, Michael. The report next contains a series of recommendations. And the first step is looking at, of course, the ground for regulatory intervention from the EU and what kind of regulatory approach should be pursued when the EU is considering the evolution of data centers. We advise here for adopting a dynamic regulatory approach based on a combination of legislation as well as standards, soft law, guidance instruments, and self-regulation. So both a mix of legally binding and non-legally binding instruments. This is also due to the fact that the data center industry is developing very quickly and we need innovation, and it is also associated with digital services. Adopting dynamic regulatory approach is also something which is advised by the Council of European Energy Regulators. In that context, some minimum common definitions, principles, and operating rules should be enshrined in EU law. And that brings us to a series of more concrete recommendations. First, in terms of streamlining with other energy-intensive industries, there is a need indeed to align the regime for the data centers with other energy-intensive industries. This requires investigating and as well comparing the types of obligation, but as well the types of incentive, would they be regulatory or financial, that energy-intensive industries benefit from in general. And as part of the alignment of the regimes, I already mentioned that the legal qualification of those different industries, infrastructures should be taken into account. So how do you make sure that we have a consistent approach, and notably through both the European Critical Infrastructure Directive, but as well, and even more importantly, the proposal for a new directive on measures for high common level of cybersecurity that will repeal the current NIS directive should be also addressed. So that's the first concrete recommendation in terms of the different alignment regimes. Next, at the upper level, the role of data centers increasingly reflected in planning for both climate and energy system. Just look at the national energy and climate plans as part of the energy governance mechanism or the national energy efficiency plans. They increasingly address data centers. And the other planning process relates to energy infrastructure, mostly in the hands of the network operators and the TSOs. So as part of the NTA, so E10-year development plan, we see that as well coming. The integration of data centers into high-level energy planning processes should be further extended. And this should also be coordinated with land and city planning. And we have identified in different case studies that there is an issue sometimes at the level of the land and city planning process. So therefore, this should be more coordinated. And that could result in better cost efficiency, resource efficiency, and as well increased local acceptance in some circumstances. So synergies across sectors and activities could be identified earlier with an emphasis on planning. Looking at eco-design requirements, we have already in several EU legislative acts requirements related to the eco-design of ICT products, and notably the regulation on eco-design requirement for servers and data storage products will be relevant. However, we don't have any legal instruments that capture the complexity of a data center, modern data center per today. So the Ecodesign directive provides a useful legal basis for further regulation of energy consumption by data centers, but this needs to be further elaborated. And notably, it could reflect some of the voluntary standards that is existing already for further harmonization. In terms of energy efficiency requirements, energy efficiency in data centers has been an area of voluntary collaboration between actors in the sectors already since the European Code of Conduct for Data Centers in 2008. And as a possible improvement, these voluntary efforts could be harmonized with the Climate Neutral DC Pact, because we have quite a lot of different initiatives and certification schemes that are existing in the market, and streamlining should be advised. On top of these voluntary industry standards, the European Commission has been promoted the energy efficiency first principles as one of the cornerstones of the European Green Deal. And this principle has as well concrete consequences for the future regulation of energy incentive industries, including the data centers. And the report looks at the different consequences these may have. So I'm referring you to our analysis in the report on that point. Next, public procurement criteria for data centers could be another area of action. And already, the Joint Research Centre has developed EU green public procurement criteria for data centers, service rooms, and cloud services that could serve as a good basis. So we have already that, but it should be further incentivized. And due to their purchasing power, public entities are well placed and should have a stronger focus, therefore, on making use of greener data centers. The other recommendation is to further commit public authorities and publicly owned entities to rely on those EU green public procurement criteria, and to consider and assess a possible shift from on-premises enterprise DCs to the cloud. Some authorities, like in the UK, have already flagged out that possibility, and one may consider that as even an assessment, mandatory requirement to assess a possible shift. Finally, in terms of grid connection, due to the particular load that data centers represent, the connection rules may be adapted according to the qualification of the data centers. And most data centers rely per today on double connection to the grid. But some better practices could be further elaborated, notably in terms of harmonization at the EU level of the regime for connection to the grid, which is already quite elaborated, but a common understanding of the connection rules applicable to these kind of industries could be welcome, and as well sharing good practices in terms of grid connection agreements for data centers among other large energy users that would, in our view, contribute to ensuring a level playing field among grid users and to provide further foreseeability for the grid management for the grid operators. So that's another concrete recommendation. Michael, back to you.
Thanks, Catherine. So just to briefly summarize our conclusions, We said at the start that it's not clear at the EU level whether there's a problem with data center energy demand in total, especially as data centers are processing data, and the use of data is essential to decarbonization in other sectors. But there clearly is an issue around specific cities and in specific sort of data center clusters. The publicly available data on what drives data center demand and location and what the data center energy consumption is very poor. And better metrics of both energy performance of data centers, but the underlying drivers in the use of particular sorts of data and how much energy that data generates the demand for on the system, that needs to be much more widely available and capable of analysis as we go forward. The industry is doing things. When we discuss this in the report, there's some good examples, as Catherine's been mentioning, of voluntary initiatives which have had higher level support. The JRC Code of Conduct and the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact, in which many of the industry players are involved. But the industry actors need to make more information publicly available. Even a metric as simple as what is total data center consumption in Europe, that is not something which it's easy to get an estimate of. There's clearly more that can be done in positive contributions of large data centers to system-wide decarbonization. We talk about how power purchase agreements are helpful, but they don't necessarily address some of the grid issues and sort of overall system adequacy issues which we see emerging in Ireland. And climate neutrality in general requires all demand to be flexible, both at the local grid level, but also at the higher level market level, in order to match supply and demand in an intermittently electricity dominated system as we go forward. I don't think the energy consumption aspects of data centers are unique. This is just about large loads. And so, I don't think we necessarily should be singling out in legislation data centers per se, as Catherine's been discussing, but simply large loads with particular electrical characteristics need to get more flexible. They need to have uninterruptible power supplies. They need to take opportunities for backup generation, and there may be a need to specify requirements of all new large loads being added to the system to meet certain standards with respect to UPS and access to backup generation, and their general requirement to contribute to system-wide flexibility. So thank you very much for listening. It's a 110-page report. There's a lot of detail in it, and we commend it to you and look forward to the discussion that's coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Michael, for a detailed presentation. As Michael just said, there's a lot to unpack in this report, so we do encourage you to have a look at it. A reminder to post your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. We have a few questions already that our panelists can see. We'll address them in a bit, but first I wanted to give all of our panelists a chance to react to the presentation. So maybe we can start with Manuel from DG Connect. With Manuel, your perspective, your reaction to the report, and maybe some background information on how the European Commission has been looking at the question of data centers.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Albéric, and thank you very much, Catherine and Michael, for the excellent presentation of an excellent report. Very briefly, I think my usual disclaimer when I'm about to discuss about energy and data centers is first that we see data centers and cloud and digital technologies as a net positive contributor to the environment and to the Green Deal. This is not to say that it's exempt from possible improvements, but it is to say that overall, in net terms, the benefits that the digital transformation brings have as a consequence a net positive for the environment. I think from my perspective, I'm extremely grateful for the study for different reasons. Obviously, the work is serious, and there's no sensationalism, which is something that happens from time to time in this area. I think it's very good as well because it's very obviously anchored in a multidisciplinary expertise, both on the technical and legal side, but as well looking at the micro aspects of data centers, but as well the macro aspects, so from the component to the grid, if you want. And I think it's a very interesting report because it builds new bridges. I think there's quite a few reports out there on looking only at the energy efficiency dimension of data centers, and this is something which has been which still requires study, but you know, it's something well explored. But this report in particular looks at how data centers looks as well at how data centers fit into the energy system and the energy grid, and you know, it's an encouragement to consider data centers as a real player of grids and to speak with grid operators and with other grid users. So this is a very interesting dimension, which I haven't seen in many reports out there. And I think this is opening new grounds for discussion and study. On your question, Albéric, of how this links with ongoing actions, I mean, I would need an hour just to go through them. But I think the tip of what's going on these days is really Catherine and Michael evoked several times the review of the Energy Efficiency Directive, which is tackling quite a few of the challenges brought by the report, namely the definition of data centers, definition, but not yet at this stage the thresholds. You know, what as of which moment you are no longer a server room, and as of which moment you become a data center. So not yet this, because this would then done in a second step in an implementing act. But it tackles the ambition of seeing more green public procurement in this area, of dealing with waste heat, at least to some extent, and of tackling as well, and I think, you know, in my personal view, this is the most important dimension, is the transparency and this idea of a repository of data center performances. So this is ongoing. This is a proposal from the Commission from August as part of the on July as part of the Fit for 55, and it's now being discussed in the Council and Parliament with, I hope, positive outcome. There's another thing which is quite fresh. It's from last week and will long go until end of January, and it's dealt as well by my colleagues from DG Energy. It's a public consultation that will feed the action plan to digitalize the energy system, where I'll retrieve the link and share it in the chat for everyone to see. But you will see that in that public consultation, and we'll see how it ends, but at this stage there are questions that are specific to data centers, and so those questions will feed into that work and might result in specific actions on data centers. So it's not urgent. It's still until after Christmas, but it's something that everyone on the call could take as an action to do, in addition to reading the document. And finally, it's not yet out, but there's a study on policy options to go beyond what I just mentioned about the Energy Efficiency Directive, which looks at a bit the same elements as today's report, but in different terms and with some additional options. And I think that's very relevant. No link yet, but stay tuned. I would expect that by November this should be out. So thanks a lot for this. And a final note: I'm very grateful, Albéric, for you to manage to gather a gender balanced panel, which is not usual enough in the NR and digital world. So I'm very grateful for that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Much appreciated. Yeah, please, looking forward to seeing this study you just mentioned, and do share the link on the public consultation that you also just mentioned. I think that would be interesting for both our panelists and the audience as well. I'm now going to give the rest of the panelists an opportunity to react as well, starting with Maya Bakash from ARCEP. Maya?
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you very much for this invitation. I really enjoyed reading the report. It's already been said, but let me say it again. It's very thorough, very comprehensive, both technical and clear. So I think it's worth reading for everyone, even those not used to technical reports. So maybe if you allow me, let me take a step back and wonder why it's important to study the data centers. Of course, you said it, but let me maybe a bit rephrase what seems to be the major issues. So you said it, it's not about demand, right? Basically, demand is not an issue because it's around 3% of the total consumption. So we could say, okay, forget about it. It's not really a major part of the problem. And second, you said it also, we need not to single out data centers because, you know, again, environmental issues are somewhere else. But it seems to me that you pointed out two major political issues. First, it's obvious, but maybe we need to say it again. We all need to do our part, right? Even if the share of data centers is small, and even if the net contribution may be positive, as Manuel just said, still, I think we cannot go on by just, you know, avoiding the problem. We all need to do our part, even if this part is somewhat smaller than other sectors. The second major issue seems to me that, I mean, I really enjoyed the part where you focus on European cities, because the issue seems to me the concentration of data centers in Europe, right? We at ARCEP tried to measure the share of data centers in France in the total energy consumption. And the share in France is around 15% and not 30%. And this is why, this is because we don't have so many data centers in France. So as you pointed out, the issue is about concentration of data centers. And I was wondering, why is it a problem? I mean, is it efficient to have data concentration? We could imagine that it's efficient to have concentration, right? And why is it a problem? So we could imagine that surely you have impact on your local consumers because the prices would be higher, because you have grid problems and so on. But still, as an economist, I would imagine that it would be easy to solve those kind of problems, right? Because you can redistribute, you can tax, you can regulate prices. Why is it a problem at the European level to have a concentration? Is it because the side effects are not well mitigated? Is it because we imagine that politically it would be difficult to redistribute, you know, from, let's say, France to Ireland? Could you maybe elaborate more on okay, now that we observed data center concentration, what should we need to do, and why is it important? The second point I wanted to discuss with you is about your regulatory proposals, and it's a very important aspect of the report. Thank you for that. I share all your recommendations. Maybe I would like to add another one that you haven't mentioned. It is about evaluating public policies in this area, because as you said, it's very complex to see the impact of a public policy in the environmental sector, because let's, for instance, look at 5G. You can imagine that on one hand you reduce the footprint, the carbon footprint, but on the other hand you would reduce transports and at the end reduce the carbon footprint, right? So it's very complex to evaluate a public policy in this area. So maybe we need to launch a scientific program and research program to really evaluate and have more information on what to do, and because the devil is everywhere in this kind of issues. The major recommendation you're making, and we are really aligned with that at ARCEP, is about harmonizing, I mean, having a common definition, a common legal definition, but also a common methodology, a common measurement methodology, common indicators. And I think it's a major issue because for two reasons. First, because of course it will help us go further and go deeper into market integration, of course, but it could also allow us to mitigate the concentration problem, because if you share a common measurement, a common indicator, common information, it will help us share the problem and solve it together. So I really do think that we need cooperation in that matter. Well, I think I could elaborate more on what we are doing in France regarding measurement issues and giving incentive at what we call regulating by data, and not only regulating data, because we believe that giving information to consumers and to public authorities could help us go along the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya, and thanks for rightly emphasizing the need for increased transparency, publicly available data, and for harmonization. On measurement, we'll pick up on this a bit later, and I'm sure that the research team will also want to pick up on some of your comments and your question regarding the issue of concentration. But I wanted to first give the floor to Mo from Airgrid to get your initial reaction to the report. The floor is yours.
Many thanks, Albéric. And I want to also extend my thanks for enabling our participation in the report and in the debates that fed into the report. We welcome the breadth of focus that the report provides. I suppose it does look at those two different scales. So it looks at the European scale, but it also then looks at the more local scale in terms of many aspects of data center growth. And I suppose we really wanted to ensure that the report had that breadth of focus, and we are pleased with the report's attention to lots of different aspects of data center integration. Like, we think it is important that the impressive efficiency aspects of the industry as a whole are recognized. Certainly as the sector has increased over the past decade, but also recognizing those challenges in terms of integrating large volumes of data center demand in certain locations. I suppose from an Irish perspective, we have a very active ICT sector, and we do wish to acknowledge the contribution that the sector has made to society, particularly in the last 2 years, as many people have had to shift rapidly to working from home, and with a massive increase in financial communications and retail transactions online. I suppose in our role as a transmission system operator, Airgrid operates the power system on a 24/7 basis across the island of Ireland, ensuring a safe and secure electricity supply to businesses and consumers. And we also have a role in planning and assessing the electricity system of the future. So I suppose in terms of the report and how it has outlined that growth in demand that we are seeing in Ireland, we are pleased that that is recognised, that the fact that we will have approximately 27% of all demand consumed in Ireland by data centres by 2030, and that's, I suppose, in the median scenario, is a considerable aspect of data centre integration for us in Ireland. And while obviously there are positive economic gains from that growth in data centre and ICT activity, there are considerable challenges in managing the system, an electricity system with that volume. And especially as we try to move towards a decarbonised power system. And I suppose in terms of data centre demand, it is welcome to see that recognition that while data centres and the developers can help accelerate renewable developments through PPAs, that it is a 24/7 power demand from a data centre or a cluster of data centres. And that does create challenges when renewables can be intermittent. And obviously in Ireland we have achieved, and as a transmission system operator, have achieved really, I suppose, groundbreaking levels of integration of renewables on a small synchronous area. So we do have an operational policy which allows 70% integration of renewables at any one point in time, and we are trialing 75% at this point. And move and have plans to move up to 95% by 2030. But I suppose, you know, there are times when the wind isn't available, and we certainly have seen that over the last couple of weeks in Ireland. And that will pose challenges as we see increasing demand from data centres over the coming years. So I suppose from an Irish perspective, we are, I suppose, looking at data centres as a unique sector. The scale of data centres in terms of the demand they place on the system, both collectively but also individually, it is unlike other energy users in that the connection capacity requested for an individual data centre can often be larger than that of a medium-sized town in Ireland. And I suppose that coupled with that demand profile, that's a flat profile that doesn't really flex during the day or night, that we need to make sure that we plan a system and have the generation capacity available to meet that demand on a 24/7 basis. So I suppose that is part of the reason that this area has received a lot of media attention in the last few weeks in Ireland. And because a recent generation capacity statement looks at the risks of meeting demand that is expected, has identified generation gaps. And I suppose there has been a recent consultation by the energy regulator, and we do expect a direction from the energy regulator on new measures for data center connections. So I suppose while the issues we're facing in Ireland may be slightly unique in that we are a small island with high levels of renewables already, and a very large clustering of data centres, some of these issues may be experienced as data centre growth continues. And I suppose we want to recognise that the report does highlight the need for sort of a more holistic consideration of all of the issues of data centre integration. And we think it will be important for policymakers, governments and the energy sector to work together to facilitate greater innovation and flexibility in terms of making sure that move towards digitalisation can be achieved alongside the move to a lower carbon energy system. I suppose just in terms of the report in general, we do welcome the report, and we do appreciate the balance between the global or the pan-European scale assessment and the local assessment. And we really would like to thank the authors for the breadth of the issues that have been covered in the report. And we also would like to thank them for the rigorous debate that has been involved in some of the meetings leading up to the finalization of the report. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mo, for giving us a bit more background on the Irish situation and what that implies for TSOs. Gareth, do you want to also give maybe more information and add your other Irish perspective to it, but from the regulator side to the debate? Or are you on mute for now?
Somebody has to do the unmute during the session. It's not a proper session if somebody has to be told not to unmute. Thank you very much. And I'd just like to echo everyone else's sort of comments on how good this report is. I think this is an example, a very good example, I think, of the value that CERRE has, because it's bringing different regulators and different sectors together, and data centers are one of those areas where these, you know, the digital world and the energy world and actually the world of environmental constraints all come together. And I think this report is just an excellent example of bringing those different skill sets together to try and address what is a major challenge going forward. Certainly in the Irish context, there's been a lot of debate about this. And I think the environment is having much broader effect. I know Maya's organization, RCEP, and ourselves both have been looking at what's the impact of the environment from a telecoms regulator point of view, and the impact on we've been sharing notes on how that's evolving. And I think it's an area where we'll have to do a lot more. But it's interesting, there used to be, I think it was Greenpeace had this thing about, are you part of the solution or are you part of the problem? And I think this is just sort of goes to the heart of the data center question. I think, Manuel, you put it very well from a commission point of view, that I think that, you know, many people, and Mo talked about the pandemic and how reliant we were on digital infrastructure. This call, you know, we have nearly 100 people, you know, participating. None of us had to go to Brussels for it. Well, some of us weren't in Brussels, but, you know, we've saved an awful lot of air miles in the process. So the data centers and the digital infrastructure that we rely on is very much part of trying to solve, you know, environmental problems. But it does have major impacts on electricity systems. And I think, while it's definitely part of the solution from a digital point of view, can it also be part of the solution when it comes to energy systems? And I think it's probably fair to say the jury's out. You know, they are a big quantum of demand. Now, you know, they have an impact on the system. I think one of the things I took from the report was a very important message about flexibility, that even if data centers are signing up for 100% renewable energy in you know, sort of in aggregate over the year, it's the impact, and Mo talked explicitly about the, you know, the 70% instantaneous, you know, renewables on the grid going to 95 instantaneous percent renewables. This is an Irish problem today, but it might actually be a global problem tomorrow. You know, in full decarbonization, where we're relying wholly on renewables and some forms of storage, this is going to be a complex problem. And this report signals some significant changes that we're all going to have to face, you know, globally in due course. So I think the report's, you know, brilliant in the way that it's been able to pull these various elements together. And I think it's probably the start of many conversations. It was good to hear the active debate as part of the development of the report. I think that also is testament to the great authors, that they managed to turn that active debate into a comprehensive and very interesting report. So I think that's as much as I can say from an Irish context. Maybe we're a little bit of a test tube in Ireland, looking at problems that will be more global problems in due course. And we'd be very happy to share information and any learnings from that process. Hopefully there's not too many mistakes in the process as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Garrett, to rightly underline some of the key issues that the transition to intermittent renewables imply. And I think, as you said, you know, that's largely addressed and mentioned in the report. Before we start taking some questions, I'm going to give the presenters, so Michael and Catherine, a chance to react to some of the comments and questions that were brought by the panelists, and maybe also to some of the questions also popped in the Q&A box. Michael, maybe do you want to start with a reaction to the panelists' reaction?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for all the comments, and I especially appreciate, as Mo was saying, the vigorous discussions that we've had about certain aspects of the report to get this far. Let me just pick up on a few of the things that Maya was saying, which I thought were really interesting. Is 3% a lot? It's a good question. I think one of the things that's true about net zero is no one can hide in net zero. No one hides in the 20% of an 80% target. Everybody is going to feel net zero. Every sector is going to be scrutinized. There's going to be questions asked about, do you really need this low carbon generation? Are you really being a good citizen in terms of the level of flexibility that you're offering? So I think 3% is a lot, because all 3% add up. And nobody gets away from net zero. So I think that's a really good point to make. I think the other question you were asking was about concentration, and why does concentration matter? And that's a really interesting question. And the answer is it does matter, because it tests systems. And I don't need to tell my Irish colleagues that. It's easy to do things if your system's not growing rapidly. If you've got gently declining demand and you've got lots of potential renewables, you can, it's easier to meet net zero. If you got sharply rising demand and limited capacity for certain types of renewables, everything is tested. Your existing connection regime is tested, your amount of interconnection, your ability to build new renewables, the types of renewables you've got access to, everything comes under scrutiny and is stress tested by growth. And of course, not everybody passes the test, because it's a difficult test to pass. Okay, so that's, I think, one thing to say. The other thing I would say is that measurement is really important. What economists generally say is we got fantastic data about the number of cows that are, being slaughtered in all European economies every month. Okay, why, we know how many sheep are being, processed every month, every country. Okay, why? Because it used to be we had economies where agriculture really mattered, and we measured every aspect of agricultural production. Okay, that is not true of the data economy. We've got really little understanding of how much of different types of data we're processing in real time, even though this is absolutely crucial to our modern economy. So we must measure all of these things much more carefully and understand what drives them. And part of, the Irish problem is, just exactly how much data demand is there going to be in Europe, and how much of it is going to come to Ireland, and how much of it is going to be processed in real time and lead to energy consumption. If we better measures of that, maybe our grid wouldn't be having so many problems in predicting what future demand might be at any given time out for the next 10 years. So, we really must do better on data. So yeah, just some reactions there. Catherine?
Yes, thank you all for the feedback, the comments, and all the different remarks and inputs as well in the Q&A box, because they are all, I think that's both the questions and comments, very useful. So I cannot comment on all of them, but they are useful input for follow-up study, maybe Albéric on that, because they are indeed we identify some issues that could be easily followed up. I just want to address maybe the comment by Maya when it comes to concentration. I think that's that fits very well with our recommendations concerning planning, and that's as well relevant for in the Irish case and other cases where they see an increase of data centers, but at the same time with different scales. And therefore, this can be better addressed through planning processes. And is that consistent with concentration level or not? That could be a useful tool, and we have it in place. So it's just a matter of integrating that criteria, that dimension, into the current planning processes, both for the energy system and the infrastructure. So it's bit more developed for infrastructure planning at the moment, but it could be further explored for energy system planning. There is a comment as to the Sustainable Products Initiative. I think that's a very good example of ongoing initiatives that where there is a need for streamlining. And I agree with the comment that the scope of the Ecodesign directive might be a challenge on that, and that this is an opportunity to see to which extent data centers will fit, modern ones will fit into the directive, or it needs to be revised. So I think it's very useful comments. Yes, I think I will stop here. There are many interesting inputs otherwise that we take on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Michael. Picking up on the measurement issue, Maya, I think it'd be interesting to hear the French perspective on this and the approach that France has taken to this. If you could.
Yes, I could briefly tell you more. So yeah, we do believe that information is key, right? That we need data for a good regulation, both because you give information to the regulator, you give information to consumers, but more importantly, you give the right incentives. With information, you give the right incentives, and that's key. So we need data. We need data, but we have many problems having those data because first we need a common definition of our indicators. What are we measuring? How do we measure it? So it's a big technical debate. And we launched in France more than a year ago a platform, a web platform to gather all stakeholders and to discuss about what we need as indicators and how we can regulate the impact of ICT on environment. And we ended by having a law in France last year, actually, and this law gives the operators, the telecommunication operators, the obligation to share with the consumers information on the impact of their own data consumption. So they have to give their consumers information on what is their footprint in a way, and what's the level of their data consumption. We need to go further, and we asked the parliament to pass a law that would give us the power to collect data, not only from telecom operators, but from other actors, such as, of course, data centers, but also terminals, producers, internet providers, service providers, and so on. And we need to have this data to construct what we call the baromètre du numérique, a barometer of the digital footprint. This law has not been passed yet, but we really hope that it should be in the few days and weeks, and that would change things because it would give us the power to ask actors to report information. And this work has been done because, as you know, we don't have a regulator of the digital sector in France, but we have many regulators, many different regulators. So we need to work together, and we launched many workflows, many reports with other regulatory agencies, and also at the BEREC level, the European regulator for the telecommunication sector, and the ARCEP co-chairs the group of experts of the BEREC on those issues. So we really hope that our initiative will be successful, and that we are at the beginning of gathering this kind of information.
Thank you very much, Maya, and it'll be interesting to see how this develops and if it's picked up in other EU countries as well. I don't know if on this, maybe Manuel, have you also observed this approach in other EU countries? Is something that you've seen? I see also that you've answered some of the questions in the chat, so if you want to react to that as well, I'll give you the floor for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, So it's obvious. It doesn't take much time of anyone looking at the data center landscape to understand that metrics are poor and not well defined, and it happens at least at two levels. First, at looking at the metrics of a given data center. So what is your performance, and then the cow problem that Michael was mentioning before. In my digital world, I usually tell the story that typically telecom regulators are aware of the location of every single GSM antenna on their territory, but are typically not aware of any, they typically don't collect data center, they or anyone else don't collect data center information. And I think this is the one of the major objectives of the Energy Efficiency Directive, is to force to put into law this idea of collecting information at national level, and then aggregate it at European level to at least have a landscape of what exists. What I mentioned earlier, and maybe now I take a minute to explain the details, is that the directive would lay down the principle on the information to be gathered. But then the details, according to which metric and according to which frequency and as of which size, and maybe to have some compound indicator on some sustainability indicator and things like this, would come at a second stage in an implementing act of the Commission. So at this stage, the idea is to agree on the principle, and we'll see the details afterwards. But it's clear, and I think Maya and I mean all reactions here show that the difficulty will be precisely in defining those metrics that need to be auditable and need to be comparable and so on and so on. Metrics which for the moment in theory exist. I mean, the ISO standard is there and is declining European standard and in all national standards, but it has really been used by engineers, I think, by data centers engineers in relationship with their own financial officer, with the one who pays the bill. Are you consuming this year less than last year for the same amount of data, or vice versa? But not with a spirit of let's compare data center A against data center B. Which is operated in a different manner, in a different building with different systems. And I think this is where all together we need to get, as Michael was saying. I mean, you cannot elaborate a proper policy without knowing the figures properly. And I think that there was another interesting piece of information, is that it's not only about data centers, it's about data. Purely data, regardless of the centers themselves. We are developing, because it's something extremely complicated and that doesn't exist yet, a methodology to understand who produces and who consumes and who processes data where in Europe, regardless of the physical infrastructure. And the methodology itself is extremely complicated, because immediately you get into notion of what is data, what is processing, what is storage, etc. And the interest here is so one aspect is the one we're discussing here about the environmental aspect, but it has to do with many other things, such as regional development, such as European autonomy vis-a-vis the world, such as the idea that when you want low latency, so computers that react very fast, servers that react very fast, you need to take into account the distance from which they're needed. And this is where the concept of those centralized data centers that in Europe you find a lot in Ireland, they will continue, but we will need as well what the digital geeks call edge cloud or edge data centers, which are very nearby with very low latency data centers that are able to react very quickly. And there's a number of applications, including in the environmental world. I was in the chat referring to, the real-time traffic management of autonomous cars in a city. You cannot allow this traffic to flow from Rome or Athens to Ireland and back. You need a latency. You need a response for the data for the car to decide where how to drive, which requires much lower latencies. And so you need the data center, the edge data centers in the vicinity of Rome or Athens. And it's this mapping at European level which will allow us to put figures on the question, and where needed in the second stage to then invest or incentivize investments in more data, local data capacity, as the EU has done historically with bridges and harbors and airports and so on.
Thank you, Manuel. Very interesting peek into the potential future of the data center industry. Paul, I wanted to ask you from ERGRID's perspective, how does this, the transparency and measurement issue impacts, TSOs, and what can be done? How's the industry and how have regulators, approach this issue, and how does this, impact your planning and the way you manage the grid?
Yeah, so I suppose having full transparency on what a connection request from a data center means in terms of not just the final sort of volume of capacity that's requested, but ensuring that there's sort of transparency in terms of the load growth of that. And then when you aggregate that across a number of data centers, I suppose that's where some if improvements in transparency of data in that regard as a TSO would help in our efficient network operation and planning. I suppose, obviously there are a number of particular issues for Ireland, and they will be addressed by the energy regulator in the coming weeks. I suppose more generally, ensuring that efficiency measurement in data centers, I suppose the more, and as others have been saying, the more information that is available in general in terms of data center operations will help energy network operators in planning their systems. I suppose what other aspects can be looked at in terms of ensuring the impact of data centers in terms of grid operations. One area that probably should get a bit more attention is ensuring that data centers can be better located in unconstrained areas, and where possible, ideally co-located with renewables, with very efficient storage mechanisms, so that their call or their demand on the national grid and 24/7 power is reduced. But obviously there's a lot of working across different energy communication regulators, government departments, business support organizations needed to achieve that, that ultimate goal. So I suppose, there are steps to ensuring the carbon emissions associated with 24/7 data center demand are reduced, and certainly, any positive steps in ensuring data centers can flex their demand and where possible match the local renewable generation output, or at least where they are, and we do have a flexible demand connection process in place now. So for data centers that have backup generation that is able to be utilized if there is a system stress event on the network, that makes sense. But at the same time, we need to make sure that that ability to flex and that ability to use their backup power generation doesn't utilize heavy carbon fuels, so that overall the system is able to decarbonize as we move towards a more flexible and a more efficient system. I think as well, I suppose we've seen the integration of artificial intelligence in reducing or in improving data center energy efficiency in their internal processes, and I think there's probably definitely some areas in that regard to be looked at and explored in more detail in terms of the use of artificial intelligence to better match load with local renewables, and just in general to improve the overall footprint of data center consumption in terms of energy, but also in terms of providing more efficient and more accessible, transparent data to all regulators and network and communication network operators.
Thank you very much, Mo. Garrett, I saw you opine and I saw you take some notes. Do you want to react to most comments and to the previous panelists' comments as well on this issue? Anything to add?
Yeah, I think there's one thing I pick up, and I suppose if we want to get data centers to act in the right way, it's all about incentives. Now, I think some of these incentives are natural. I mean, I think Manuel talked about, well, you want to get your energy cost down because why would you pay more rather than less? That's been quite a strong incentive, I think, for data centers. Naturally, in terms of the clustering, I mean, Ireland, one of the things we hear constantly is it's a cold climate. We don't get very hot temperatures in the summer. Therefore, you naturally don't have the same cooling load that you might have somewhere else. So that's another natural incentive. I think latency, from a telecoms point of view, is having the centers close to where the demand is needed for particularly products where you need low latency. And latency is, this is edge computing sort of comes into this to some extent as well, is an important factor. But there are areas where I think we need to add incentives. I think this whole question of, is there enough incentives in the energy system to get data centers to do the right thing or get other people to respond to the new needs that data centers add to the system? The question about flexibility, the exposure to real-time markets, volatility in real-time energy markets might be a good thing. Sometimes that excess volatility, negative prices, these can all drive very strong incentives, and companies they're looking after their shareholders. It's a bit, we can't ask as regulators for people to do things that's not in our commercial interest to do. I think we need to design those incentives to align their interests with the public interest. I think grid locations is one we've constantly struggled with, as my previous role as an energy regulator. How do you get people to go to the right place? I think trying to do that is complicated, but it's important. And I think we need to keep working on grid incentives. Carbon markets are important as well. So, this is part of the ETS. So whether it happens in one part of Europe or another part of Europe from an ETS market point of view doesn't really matter, because you've got a common ETS market across Europe. Is that working in the right way and giving the right incentives across all the parts of the ETS? So you've got all these various incentives, but I think the challenge is to try and get them all lined up so that you get the right actions and you turn this into a virtuous circle rather than creating all sorts of unintended consequences. And I think this report is a start on that, and I think it's started to address some of those complex issues that hopefully will get a good outcome.
Thank you very much, Garrett. We're nearing the end, so I'm looking at some additional questions. I see there were a few questions regarding electricity and heat coupling, and how if we've looked at that issue. I think that also, we could also refer to previous work done by CERRE on the issue of system integration and sector coupling. I think, Michael, you were involved in that work, so maybe you want to tackle these questions that we've got in the Q&A box on the waste heat.
Yeah, well, just to say, there are examples of use of waste heat by data centers, and we discuss some of them in the report. And clearly, just to pick up on Garrett's point, if you're getting your general incentives for net zero right, then you would expect data centers to respond to that. They are big commercial loads. And as the incentives to proceed with heat decarbonization increase, then of course you might want to become economic to make use of large heat loads and actually potentially distribute them to local communities. So yeah, I mean, if we start getting all of these incentives right, we we should see data centers respond to that. And one of the points that we emphasize in the report is a test of whether net zero policy is working at the EU level is that we see large loads like data centers actively participating in net zero. That does require incentives, because as we discussed in the report, these things don't come for free. Yes, data centers do have a backup power supply, but they don't always have a zero carbon generator attached to that. They may have space for generation, but they may not have used it for generation. They may have incentives to be flexible, but unless they've got the right power electronics fitted to their equipment, which is not cheap, they're not going to be doing it. So, yes, there's potential, and but we do need to get these incentives right.
Thank you, Michael. I see that Catherine also has her hand up, so I will give her the floor, and that will probably be the last comments for today's session.
Yes, thanks, Albéric. A short comment is something that we have not yet addressed very much, but it's the different dynamics. You see countries that are trying to attract very much data centers. And just to give you an example, in August, the Norwegian government published a new strategy on data centers based on all the benefits of the energy system in the Nordics. And at the same time, you need to put some requirements for having green data centers. So we see those two dynamics at the same time, and that is a good example for the use of waste heat, where there was a proposal of mapping waste heat and how it could be better exploited with regard to the energy system. So to put a requirement on that when you're developing the data centers. So there are many interactions, and it goes in, both attracting data centers, but the data centers that also deliver different benefits to the whole energy system. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. With this, I think we're going to wrap up. As everybody rightly pointed out, it is a very complex issue, and I think we could be sitting here for 3 hours talking about this, and there would still be a lot to unearth. It was great to hear, perspectives from the industry, policymakers, and regulators on this, and we hope that this discussion did shed some light on this issue. There's room for further research, because carbon neutrality implies greater energy efficiency, integration, flexibility for all actors of the energy system. So there's definitely things to look into, and CERRE is keen to work further on that issue. So we'll continue in that direction. Just a quick plug to our next two events. So next week on Tuesday, we are launching our last paper on theories of harm. So that will be Tuesday, October 19 at 2 p.m. And on Thursday at 6 p.m., so Thursday, October 21st, our Director General, Bruno Lieberberg, will be in conversation with Thierry Breton and Patrick Gelsinger, CEO of Intel, on the issue of chips. So the event's called Chips, an EU third way for crunch, from crunch to strategic autonomy. So that's one not to miss. Thank you all again for joining us, presenters, panelists, the audience. And don't forget to sign up to a newsletter, social media streams for further updates. And see you next time. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining.